I knew you'd ask the question, so I'll try to just answer them now. We all know there are a number of big issues that we need to deal with, and deal with them now. Today, Secretary of Defense Hagel announced that there's going to be 800,000 civilian defense employees furloughed. 800,000. Our economy is still not creating jobs as fast as we would like, and Republicans are threatening to hold the full faith and credit of the United States hostage again. These are the issues that matter to middle-class Americans. Pocketbook issues. That's important in Nevada and across the country. And yet, Republicans are talking about everything but pocketbook issues. Once again, middle-class Americans are seeing Republicans focus on everything but the issues they care most about. But if Republicans insist on talking about these other issues, let's talk about them. What the IRS did, of course, is inexcusable. But this is not the first time we've seen this. It wasn't long ago that the IRS inappropriately targeted the NAACP, Greenpeace, and a California church who was really progressive, called the All Saints Church in Pasadena, California. It was interesting at that time, we didn't hear a single Republican grandstand the issue then. Where was their outrage when groups on the other side of the political spectrum were under attack? I believe we need to take action to stop this inappropriate behavior of the Internal Revenue Service. I believed it then, I believe it now. I've spoken with the chairman of the Finance Committee and asked him to hold hearings soon, examining what should be done. We talked this morning again. We, of course, need to wait until the Inspector General's report is completed. They expect that to be within a week or 10 days. But there's another issue at stake here. And we cannot lose sight of this. There are these shadowy political groups masquerading as social welfare organizations in order to solicit anonymous donations from we don't know who, big corporations and also wealthy people. That needs to stop. We do not know exactly how much money was spent in the last election by these groups. And I acknowledge most of the money was spent on the right wing, but there was plenty on the left wing. It's said to be almost $1 billion. And I ask, what has Karl Rove ever done to improve the social welfare of the United States? That's what these shadowy organizations are supposed to do. That's what their charter says. His organization, Rove's organizations, have one purpose and one person only, and that's to defeat Democrats. Anyone who thinks otherwise is being willfully foolish. Preventing overtly political groups, like the ones run by Karl Rove, from masquerading as social welfare organizations is really a critically important task, whether these groups are on the left or on the right. But the IRS may not be the right organization to perform the task, but perhaps what we haven't done leaves that organization the only one we have to look to. In 2010, Democrats advanced something called the Disclose Act that would have taken the IRS out of the business of investigating these groups. Not a single Republican voted with us on the Disclose Act. So again, I ask, where was the outrage of the Republicans then? We should take another look at the Disclose Act. While we must stop these abuses by the IRS, we must also crack down on efforts by Karl Rove and others to exploit our tax code and pour unlimited amounts of money into our political system, masquerading as social welfare. Okay, let's talk now about Benghazi, which is an issue that Republicans continue to talk about. And remember, this is an issue that one of the Hill newspapers said that Speaker Boehner was obsessed with it. They're hyperventilating about Benghazi. President Obama was absolutely right to call this a sideshow. This is about smear politics and nothing else. Where was the Republicans' upstanding outrage on this? Well, earlier this year, they didn't say a word when Republicans held up for months and months security funding of our embassies. They're still doing this. We have 1,000 Marines that we're trying to fund. That's being held up. And these Marines would go to our embassies. Again and again, Republicans have blocked, opposed, or reduced embassy security funding. And they continue to support the sequester, which would further reduce embassy security funding. So, again, where is their outrage on this? The real fact is that Republicans are more concerned about giving President Obama a black eye and taking shots at Secretary Clinton than actually tracking down the people who performed these outrageous acts of terrorism and bringing them to justice. Instead of securing our diplomatic posts, Republicans want to debate who changed talking points. And one need only look at the New York Times today and read the Republican conservative columnist David Brooks. He outlines it pretty well, saying this is just not right, what they're trying to do. The president has made it clear that his focus is on bringing these terrorists to justice. The State Department has embraced the recommendations of the Joint Review Board, headed by Ambassador Pickering, who will go down in history. It's one of the best Foreign Service officers this country's ever had. And of course, the patriotic Admiral Mullins. And the State Department is implementing their recommendations right now as we speak. In the Senate, the committees of jurisdiction have investigated this issue extensively and heard testimony from those involved. But again, I ask, where were the Republicans' outrage? Where was it when dozens of diplomatic posts were attacked under President Bush? 64 to be exact. 64 diplomatic posts were attacked during the Bush administration. This issue is about generating headlines and campaign fodder for Republicans and nothing else. I've read, I repeat, that my colleague Speaker Boehner is obsessed with these attacks, Benghazi attacks. If he wants to continue showing the Republicans are ignoring the middle class in order to rile up the Tea Party base, that's his choice, because that's what's happened. But it's wrong. It's a wrong choice for our economy and the interest of middle class Americans. Finally, the Associated Press. I have trouble defending what the Justice Department did in going after looking at the AP. You know, I really believe in the First Amendment. I think it's one of the great things we have as a country. And I don't know who did it or why it was done, but it's inexcusable. And there's no way to justify this. In my career, I've stood consistently for freedom of the press, from encroachment by the national security community, and I'm going to continue to do that. It's an issue I feel very strongly about, and look further into whether more legislative action is needed in this regard to secure freedom of the press. Okay, I answered all your questions?
Senator Reid, the ordeal was very sensitive and put the American people at risk. Does that change your view of the investigation?
No. I believe that I'm giving you my opinion. I think that someone from the Justice Department could have gone to the AP and said, hey, will you help us with this? They said no, fine. Then they could have maybe gone a step further. But I don't think this is fair just to start subpoenaing records.
Leader Reid, on the IRS matter, is it possible that some of your colleagues trying to get a handle on 501c4s may have been the catalyst for the IRS then reaching?
I really don't know. All I know is when you have almost $1 billion spent on affecting good things socially for the American people, this isn't one of them. I believe that, I won't get into too much the technicalities of this, the law is very, very clear that these organizations are to devote their time to the actual word is, what do I do with it? Social welfare. Before I couldn't come up with that word. Very clear. The IRS, frankly, changed it. I think they had no right in the law to do so, but they changed it so it's now somewhat confusing, and it shouldn't be. When we passed the law, it was very direct what it means. I think it's awful. I repeat, almost $1 billion, I've said that 3 times here, spent in these campaigns. That shows how awful that Citizens United case was, and we have to do something about it. Whether it's liberal groups that are being, are raising that money, or conservative groups.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to make a few observations about the administration's abuse of power. We now have focused the attention of everyone, including all of you, on the lengths to which the administration is willing to go to quiet the voices of its critics. My colleagues, including Senator Hatch, our ranking member on the Finance Committee, will focus, at least to some extent, on the IRS. I want to talk about the broader picture here. Over the last year, actually going back to 2009 now that I think about it, we've seen the efforts of the administration to quiet the voices of their critics. Back during the debate on Obamacare, it was the directive by the Secretary of HHS to health insurance companies that they could not tell their customers, those who bought their products, what they thought about Obamacare. A directive from the Secretary of HHS quieting the voices of critics of Obamacare. Now you've noticed the Secretary is out raising money from the private sector, people who are dependent upon the government's regulations, to help the government convince the public that Obamacare is a good measure. We've had examples of initiatives over at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, and of course continuously at the FEC to engage in the kind of government regulatory activity that is targeted at silencing the critics of the administration. I'm not being critical of all of you, but most of you haven't paid much attention to any of that. But now I think you get it. And I think the American people get it, because everybody understands what the IRS is. Many people think the most powerful agency of the federal government with the ability to literally put people out of business. We've seen what they can do, and there is a measure that I expect we'll see from the Democrats, because we saw it in the previous Congress and the one before that, called the Disclose Act, which is designed to give the IRS even more power directly to quiet the voices of the critics of this administration. It's important that not only that legislation be defeated, but that the administration get the message that the federal government should not be used to quiet the voices of the critics of the Obama administration. Let me turn to Senator Hatch, in particular on the IRS issue.
Let me just say this, that I've never seen anything quite like this except in the past, during the Nixon years. What the IRS asserted on Friday is simply not true. It wasn't just some lowly staffers in the Cincinnati office. In fact, that's a pretty important office in the IRS. Very senior management at the IRS here in Washington knew what was going on for over a year, and they didn't even say a word. In fact, after the IRS leadership learned of this, they sent Congress letters saying that the targeting of conservative groups wasn't happening. This was either one of the greatest cases of incompetence that I've ever seen, or it was the IRS willfully not telling Congress the truth. At no point in time did anyone at the IRS think it appropriate to set the record straight. Not at one point. Now, the American people deserve the truth. There is no single agency in government that has the power that the IRS has. They can destroy people. And frankly, this is an agency that can create more fear in the hearts of people than any other agency. What we need to know, let me just mention three things. Why didn't the IRS correct the record once it became clear conservative groups were targeted? I sent them at least 3 letters on this. How high on the chain of command in the Obama administration did this go before it was revealed that this was happening last Friday? Why did it take a Treasury Inspector General report to get the IRS to own up to this? These are questions that have to be answered, and there's a reason Congress is the co-equal branch of government. Something I wonder if the administration fully appreciates. And we are going to fully examine what they are doing to ensure the people of our nation have confidence that we are looking out for the public and for the public interest. Senator Baca says he's willing to hold hearings on this, willing to look into it, willing to get into it and do it the appropriate way. We're talking about liberty here. We're talking about the right of freedom in America. And if we can manipulate the IRS, if the administration can do that, or anybody in the administration, or anybody in the IRS can do that, then everybody in this country's got to be very, very fearful. And freedoms will be lost, liberty will be lost, and we'll all be the worse for it.
By any measure, it's been a tough few days for the administration. The president today got 4 Pinocchios on his story on Benghazi from the Washington Post. We also know, obviously, that the statements that were made to members of Congress that the IRS was not targeting political speech that the administration disagreed with is absolutely false. And we learned from Gallup that half of small businesses are saying that the implementation of Obamacare is hurting their business, not helping. But in 2011 and 2012, I had constituents in Texas, groups like King Street Patriots, the Tea Party groups from Waco and San Antonio, and an organization called True the Vote, who reported to me that they felt like they were being targeted by the Internal Revenue Service. And of course, that resulted in, among other things, a letter that Senator Hatch and I and others wrote, and protestations by the commissioner of the IRS saying, no, it was absolutely false. Well, now we know that my constituents were telling the truth. They were targeted for their political views, and what we were told by the commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service was false. I applaud Senator Baucus and Senator Hatch for, on a bipartisan basis, saying that the Finance Committee was going to look into this as far as the IRS is concerned. And I hope all other standing committees in the Senate who have jurisdiction over the FCC, the SEC, HHS, and of course the IRS will, on a bipartisan basis, get to the bottom of this and find out where it leads.
For an administration that promised to be the most transparent in history, the Obama administration has a credibility gap that's growing at an alarming rate. We now know that there were senior administration officials that knew about the bullying of conservative-leaning organizations. The Washington Post is reporting that confidential information on those conservative organizations was released to ProPublica. If you look at all these various things that the leaders have mentioned, whether it's Fast and Furious or Benghazi or the SEC or the FCC, you go right down the list. This is an administration that's playing really fast and loose with the rules and should be a concern for all Americans. And just as a personal example of this, last month I sent a letter to the EPA because the Obama administration had released the information on 80,000 farmers and ranchers to some liberal environmental groups, and that included names, addresses, phone numbers, geographic coordinates, all kinds of information. 500 farm or ranch families in South Dakota were impacted by that. But it's just another example of an administration that has gotten out of control when it comes to this abuse of power. And I think that this is something that ought to concern every American, and hopefully, as was pointed out, these investigations and hearings get underway, we'll get more of the facts out there for the American people to have at their disposal But this is a pattern that is very, very concerning, and one that I think every American who cares about the Bill of Rights, every taxpayer in this country ought to be very concerned about.
The president's health care law, I've been saying, it's bad for paychecks, it's bad for patients, and it's bad for jobs. And now with revelations this last week, there's an additional dark cloud over the health care law. One relates to the IRS. These are the folks that are the president's health care law. This is what I call the Sebelius shakedown. And what I want to know is, what is she promising those businesses that she talks to, and what is she threatening them with? Remember, Kathleen Sebelius has been found in violation of the Hatch Act during the 2012 presidential election. Now she's shaking down companies, executives throughout the country. Why? Looking for money to cover over and cover up the train wreck that is happening with the president's health care law.
Well, as a couple of people said, nothing scares the American people like the three letters IRS. And if the reports of the last 24 hours are true, including the one that Senator Hatch just made about writing the IRS and getting misinformation back, the report yesterday was that the acting commissioner, Stephen Miller, learned about this in May of 2012, and in responding to members of the House, members of the Senate, and a committee in the House, just failed to answer the question with information he had. If that's true, if he was aware that conservative groups were being targeted and was asked about that and gave incorrect information, he should step aside or be removed. And this is something that we shouldn't tolerate. The administration shouldn't tolerate it, and the American people wouldn't want us to tolerate it.
Last Wednesday, in the Appropriations Subcommittee that has the responsibility for the appropriations for the Secretary of the Treasury, including the IRS, I asked Secretary Lew as well as Commissioner Miller, Acting Commissioner Miller, to respond to me on allegations that information had been released by the IRS, quote, inadvertently, unquote. I'm awaiting those answers to those questions. Every American should expect even-handed treatment by the Internal Revenue Service. That is now in question, and it lends credibility to the reports, both in the press and by our constituents and organizations across the country, that information related to their donors were released to organizations that have opposite political points of view of those organizations. And so I think that the story continues. Not only is it terribly inappropriate that the IRS would treat applications by one politically leaning organization differently than another, but now it lends credibility to the stories, the belief that information is being released by the IRS for purposes of political persuasion. Every American should be able to expect even-handed treatment from the Internal Revenue Service, and that clearly is not the IRS or the administration we have.
Before taking a few questions, let me just add one thing. As you continue to file your stories on this subject, ask yourself before you write, how would I be writing this story if this were a Republican administration? Be happy to take a few questions. Yeah.
A lot of Republicans were calling for more of a crackdown on the leaks of national security administration information. And I just wondered if this subpoenaing of phone records is the kind of crackdown that you all had in mind.
Well, my colleagues can speak for themselves, but it strikes me that this Justice Department inquiry will go forward, and we'll look forward to seeing what, if anything, comes from it.
Senator McConnell, at least as far back as 1987, you were pretty dubious that social welfare groups were actually social welfare groups. Regardless of this, what appears to be the uneven handling here, does Congress and the IRS need to take another look at whether or not these groups should get social welfare status?
As I've said consistently for over 2 decades, and now the Supreme Court has underscored, you have a right to engage in the political debate in this country. Even corporations have a right to engage in the political debate. Prior to the Citizens United case, for example, there was a special carve-out for corporations that own all of you. You could say anything you wanted to at any time about any of us or any issue you wanted to But if you were a corporation that didn't own a media outlet, you couldn't. Citizens United leveled the playing field. We now have a system under which people are able to fully discuss their grievances. We have a government that spends $3.6 trillion a year. It's big enough to adversely impact all of us. And people are entitled not only to petition the Congress for redress of grievances under the First Amendment, but to say whatever they choose to in criticism or praise by any of us.
They also have tax-exempt status.
Next question. Yeah, Paul?
Do you feel there should be a special prosecutor or some sort of special investigation that's independent of the Obama administration and the whole DOJ?
Are you talking about
on the
IRS?
Yeah.
Well, I think there'll be a full congressional investigation. As Senator Hatch indicated, apparently there's a bipartisan desire on the Finance Committee to look at IRS. Chairman Camp has indicated in the House, and Majority Leader Cantor have indicated they intend to fully investigate it. There are lots of questions. I think Congress is fully capable of conducting an independent review of what went on, and we anticipate that they certainly will do that in the House. And if Chairman Baucus meant what he said, I assume that will be done in the Senate as well.
Prevaricate, mislead, and dissemble about. Can the public trust this administration? Can the public trust its government to provide accurate information about the war on terror or anything else? Similarly, if IRS officials knew that their agency was targeting certain political activity and failed then to hold anyone accountable, how can the American people ever trust the Internal Revenue Service or the federal government to be neutral and law-abiding? I heard the junior senator from Virginia on the radio as I came in this morning, Senator Kaine, who asked, I thought, a pretty good question. He said, what does it take to get fired in this town? What does it take to get fired in this administration for cover-ups, for misleading the American people? If Secretary Sebelius is willing to strong-arm the very industry she regulates to fund the implementation of Obamacare, can the American people trust her agency to be objective, even-handed, and fair-minded as a regulator? All this boils down into a very sad statistic that demonstrates that the public's confidence in the federal government, and particularly in Congress, is at an all-time low. That's not the end of the story. Shouldn't be the end of the story. That ought to be the beginning of a bipartisan effort to get to the bottom of these abuses, but also to restore ourselves to the constitutional framework that our founding fathers envisioned when this great experiment in democracy was created more than 200 years ago. It wasn't a national government that dictated to the rest of the country how you should run your life, what choices you should make. It was a federal system of separated powers with checks and balances, with authority given to the federal government to do things that individuals and the states could not do by themselves, like national defense. But we've gotten far afield from the framers' vision of how our country should operate, or from the constitutional system that they created and which we celebrate. Now more than ever, Washington needs credibility. If you don't have the public's trust, how in the world are you ever going to gain their confidence that we are going to address the many challenges that our country faces? I'm not pessimistic about our future. I am optimistic about our future, but it will take a change of attitude. It will take a change of behavior. It will take, in some sense, a return to the founders' philosophy on the framework and the structure in which our government operates. Because for too long, the federal government has said we know best. If you don't like it, it's because we haven't given you enough information to convince you to like it, and to take the policies that are unpopular and merely to shove them down the throat of the American people and think we're doing our job. But we know we have huge challenges which call on us to work together on a bipartisan basis to regain the public's confidence, and I know we can do it if we will. It's a matter of whether we have the political courage and the will to do it. And here are some of those challenges. The longest period of high unemployment since the Great Depression. The largest percentage of the American workforce that's simply given up and quit looking for jobs because the economy is so weak. The second challenge is a woefully unpopular health care law that even some of the architects of that law now say they see a train wreck occurring in its implementation. And we know our world continues to be dangerous, as Benghazi reminds us. And we see from murderers like Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and people who threaten innocent people with chemical weapons and murder, fighting for their very lives in places like Syria, and Iran on a pathway to develop a nuclear weapon, which will completely disrupt the balance of power in the Middle East and create an arms race while other countries seek their own nuclear weapon. And let's not forget Iran is the primary state sponsor of international terrorism with its support for Hezbollah, among others. And we've seen in North Africa and elsewhere the proliferation of al-Qaeda affiliates and allies. And yes, we also need to fix our broken immigration system. Now, none of these individually are easy things to do. All of them are hard, but they're not impossible. If we will try to work hard to regain the public's credibility, and we will simply do our work and respect the wisdom of the ages when it comes to concentration of power and its impact on individual liberty. And the temptation when power is absolute to see that power corrupted and abuse that power when it comes to dealing with the American people. Unfortunately, so far, the Obama administration has valued its agenda more than its credibility. Without regaining credibility, we will never regain the public's trust. And without that trust, it will be much, much harder to solve America's biggest problems. That is the biggest single challenge to President Obama's second-term agenda, and to our ability as Americans to show that this 200-plus year experiment in self-government actually works. Mr. President, I yield the floor.